Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Level Agency's Test, Learn, Grow podcast, where we believe all marketing should create value, build trust, and inspire change. I'm your host for today, Dale Reether, Digital Marketing Lead here at Level. In this episode, we're going to dive into a really interesting discussion related to B2B marketing around the importance of creating personalized content for your audiences consistently and some tips for how to do it right, effectively, and efficiently. As B2B marketers, we all know content is crucial, but also know it can be really hard to create impactful content that resonates consistently, especially when resources are limited, which I know a lot of people have that problem right now. We're going to talk about some ways you can get more efficient and effective whenever it comes to content planning and development. And with that, I'm joined by my colleague, Laura Greenewalt, who is currently leading one of our B2B cross-functional teams here at Level. Laura, how's it going? Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Dale. Super glad to be here. This is one of my favorite topics because, I come from a background of performing arts, playwriting, and found my way into digital marketing in kind of a different path than maybe most would take. So content and how we talk to our audiences is really important to me. It's kind of the thing that gets me out of bed working with my team most days.
Yeah. That's awesome. And I know it's something that's really important in the industry right now. Everybody is talking about content, especially with the uprising of AI. So I think there's some interesting conversations we can get into around that later on in the episode. But I just wanted to kick things off by just defining what we mean by personalized content. So when we think about that for our clients, how are you thinking about it? Because I know there are a couple different routes that you can go with personalization, but let's just set the record straight here on how we're thinking about it for today's conversation.
Absolutely. So personalization is really how you strategically approach the segments within your target audience. We can go all the way into the nitty gritty and talk about little tactics like dropping in a dynamic token for, say, your email marketing. But really, like if you come up to the strategy itself, personalization is understanding your segments, understanding what motivates them, and building content that helps them answer questions or find value in your product. So we hash this out in a lot of different ways. There's no one formula, but your client and their customer set should help you kind of guide how you segment. And from there, you start to decide what makes each of these segments different. How do we address those different segments?
Totally. And in my mind, I think it starts from developing your ideal customer profile, which we will be talking about in our next episode here. But there's so many different ways to segment your audience out beyond that. And it's highly encouraged, I think, from us to do that. Do you want to give some examples of like, here's your ideal customer profile as a whole? What are some of the different segments within that you can, that's a route you can take in order to get just more segmented, more easy to make things resonate with specific people?
Sure. So I'll give you one that's in motion right now. This is a client we're working with on the B2B One team. I won't drop any names, but they work in the real estate industry. And we were talking about some new approaches to their marketing strategy for the back half of this year. And we wanted to do a little test. And to figure out who our segments really were, we ran some data against different agents, so real estate agents in the California market in particular. We looked for patterns in those agents, their individual personal behaviors, as well as market by market behaviors. And we ultimately came up with actually 6 unique segments. And it's a matrix, right? But this matrix breaks it down across geographic segments and then what we're calling the strategic or tactical agent. And the way this looks on paper is we have one market that doesn't look like anything else in that state. If you live in California or you market in California, you probably know where I'm going with this, but LA. The LA DMA is not like anything else in really the country when it comes to real estate. So LA gets its own treatment. From there, we break out those agents into our more tactical agents. Those are the people who are maybe struggling to hit the baseline in terms of sales or cost per sale. And then we have our more strategic agents. They're zipping along. They're probably seeing some growth year over year in their own business. So in that LA market, we're marketing to both of those segments with really unique LA specific messaging. From there, we looked at the rest of the state and we said, what's pretty hot in real estate terms and what's maybe a little softer? So not the markets that are really underperforming, but the markets that maybe were hot a year or two ago and have kind of cooled down. And so that makes up the next two segments, right? We have our hot segment, our soft segment, and again, that tactical and strategic breakout. Why this is important. Real estate, for all intents and purposes, is the most hyper-local thing you can do. You can't really take the same practice from Idaho or Arizona and apply it in California. But right now, what this company has been doing has been exactly that. Approach the whole country as if it's the same. So we drilled down with our data team. We found out that these segments do exist. We validated how many people kind of fell into each. And then we started mapping content and thinking about what does it take to move from a very tactical approach into something more strategic in the real estate industry. And that helped us build a really nice set of messaging matrices across each of them that we're starting in that content development stage now.
Totally. And I'm glad you started to dive into why this is important. And I think, real estate is a really easy way to see that because each geo is so different. But then you start to go into, there's different types of agents within each of those geos, and you want to talk to them differently. And I think, it's so important for your message to resonate on such a personal level. But I bet you there's people on the other side of this that are starting to hear, okay, sounds like you have 3 ideal customer profiles within agents as a whole. And then you have how many different cities are you targeting, right? Like that can start to get really big and messy and time consuming. How do you think about scaling that? Some things that come to mind for me is just like maybe grouping like-minded geos. You want to dive into that a little bit more? Because it sounds like a lot of work. It's super important, but how do we do it in an efficient way?
Yeah. So we started, we got way down into the weeds and we looked at market by market by market. And then we did exactly what you said. We rolled things up. So we know what say counties and DMAs fall into that soft market. We know what counties and DMAs fall into our hot markets. And then, like I said, LA kind of stays on her own path. She's a completely different animal. And then within it, we don't want to overcomplicate. We're making some assumptions about these agents and what their motivations are. We have a lot of data about that as well. And so when we actually get to the audience strategy, we have a couple different ways we're handling that data. But for the most part, we're folding those strategic and tactical folks into the same audience. And we're driving multiple types of messages against them that speak to the different needs. So in our hot market, we have one super defined audience, and we are targeting all of those messages against that same group. And we're watching kind of where do things start to fall out, what messages rise to the surface here in this group. And through some of our data mapping, we can see where we start to make impacts.
Yeah, totally. I think one thing you called out there is really important. Need and pain point is really in my mind, the crux of how you determine. So we talked about personalized content. Well, how do you determine what's personal to these people? And I think it's pain. It's what are the challenges that they face on a daily basis at different points in the customer journey? How can we develop content that speaks to those to help them either go beyond a challenge or learn something new, or I have a tool that helps them to do something within their day-to-day, is really how I start to think about personalized content. And I think what you called out there in terms of testing a bunch of different messages at the same time is crucial too, because one, you don't really know until you know, right? We got to test and let the data tell us. And two, there might be some things even within, we're talking segments on segments here, but there might even be different segments that you start to find within those smaller ones where, okay, this resonates with this type of person versus this type of person. And something might resonate differently with somebody on any, just depending on the mood they're in that day. So I think, trying to find a handful of things that are pain points, challenges, needs, or goals for any given customer segment that you have, and testing those within the same campaign is super important.
Absolutely. I mean, here to that whole take. When we're thinking about the segments, sometimes they are really clear. Like it can be really obvious who your buyers are, what it is that they need, and you might be able to say like, oh, I can hack this out and say if they're moving outside of this real estate example, but I can say, this is what the financial officer is going to care about at this company versus this is what the boots on the ground person who uses our technology is going to care about. That might be a very obvious thing in your current business. And you should have those messages for both of those audiences. That's the personalization piece. Explain to the boots on the ground person how your software integrates with tools they're already using, and then explain to that, CFO how this saves you money from building this technology yourself or cobbling something together from multiple other technologies. That is still personalization, even if it doesn't maybe plug in a detail or a company name or something like that right into it.
Totally. We're not even touching like the true ABM, account-based marketing piece.
Right.
Chris. Another point that I wanted to drill into that we touched on for a second there, not to add more work to people's plates that are listening to this, we already talked about segmenting by geo, segmenting by ICP, but I think, it's also really important to segment by perceived point in the customer journey. Do you want to talk a little bit about what are the different types of content that we might think about developing based on whether we think someone's more in a, hey, they haven't heard of this brand versus they might be considering this versus they've engaged. We think they're ready to possibly make a decision about becoming a customer. How do you segment not only message, but content type in that way?
Yeah, I think coming back to kind of your core strategy, knowing what your goal is, and then it's never going to be perfect, but knowing a rough idea of what your audience's journey looks like to get to the purchase. Like you can't do any of this if you don't understand that. Doesn't have to be perfect. Don't let that stand in the way of getting something on paper. But once you've mapped that journey and you know that generally people are going to start with their problem, they're going to start some research, they're going to consider alternatives, know who your competitors are, all of that. Once you have that framework in place, you can start to craft messages that address each of those stages in the journey. It'll never be the same for two companies, for sure. But often on our team, we start with something that looks a little bit like at the top of the funnel in the research phase, we're using a little bit more of, say, the organic website where we have blog content, or we're using social channels to share success stories, things like that at the top of the funnel are going to stand out for a person who's really looking at the big picture. Then as we move into the mid-funnel, we start combining different types of resources. So can we give them a tool that helps them take a couple steps toward the solution on their own? We've used things like calculators, or we have some downloadable spreadsheets we've worked with our clients on to help solve specific accounting problems, for example. So in that mid-funnel, when someone's really trying to consider what their tools might be or what their solution might be, can we give them some tools? Let them take a taste test. Let them try something themselves. As they move further and further down the funnel, we might put something in front of them that encourages them to try our specific product. And that content is probably going to look a little bit more like let's share some testimonials or behind the scenes, or video content about what the platform actually does. And then in that conversion layer, we're looking at things that help them make the financial decision that they need to, or sort of contextualize it within their current business ecosystem, and usually driving them a little bit closer to a conversation with sales, a conversation with a buying team, a customer success team.
Totally. I totally agree with all that. And I think what you said about like really knowing, it all comes from really knowing your audience, right? And really mapping out that customer journey. And I think what you said in terms of, I think the lens that you were talking about through is what are the types of resources that we think they're going to need at each point of where they are and learning about the brand, about the company. But I think it's also really important, one, your take on this, as you're mapping out that customer journey, what are the platforms that they are generally going to be on at each of those points? Because that's going to drive a lot of this too. And I like to think about it in kind of like a passive and active consumption mode. So for example, if we're doing like like brand awareness campaign, prospecting campaign, whatever you want to call it, most of the time those people are going to be in a passive consumption mode. So think about like a LinkedIn or a TikTok. You want to personalize the content based on the platform and what that person is doing in that moment. Like if you think about it, and we do this all the time, if you're scrolling on TikTok, it's Thursday night, you're not working anymore. Like it's probably not a good idea to try to get someone to read a 30-page ebook while they're just trying to scroll and find something funny. You might want to personalize that to, one, the platform that matches the content they try to expect, and two, delivering the insight directly right there so you can get a point across. And not try to navigate them away from what they're doing. And I think on the flip side of that, where you talked about so we're the mid funnel and bottom of funnel, where people are like in a research mode, and you think about a search, that's where that ebook might play better because they are actively looking for it. And that's the type of information they need at that moment. So I get thinking about point in the customer journey, what are the platforms and consumption mindsets that they are in within those? You might have some overlap between them, but I think it's really about just understanding your audience, the customer journey, in the frame of mind that they're in. These are real people that you're marketing to with normal lives beyond work. So I think that piece is really important as well here.
For sure. Like the way that, to layer like one more on top of that, you're thinking about these points in the journey. You're making sure that something speaks to them in a way that they're open to listen to. And then think about, as you're planning your budget, as you're planning your channels, what are you measuring against at each of these stages? And, your TikTok example is interesting. We're probably not going to get a direct purchase out of a single TikTok ad. That isn't really the point, though. If you have that clear takeaway, and instead of getting a purchase, you're getting consistent saves, you're getting engagement on the post, you're getting shares, those things are valuable to know. And if it's working there, you can think about how to scale that piece of content up, turn it into something maybe a little bit higher value. Does that one TikTok ad become a 3 or 4 series content play on YouTube, right? And is it valuable to dig in deeper with that group and with that segment because you see that those shares are happening, or you see that those saves are happening, and you realize, oh, this is a good one. Let's go deeper. Let's go wider. Let's get it out on a bigger distribution scale. So you're watching kind of all of these pieces, and I think that we've been building from the segment all the way up to this measurement story. But ultimately what you're trying to tell a story to a person and help them see themselves in it, and then figure out how to scale that beyond just this one touch point, and what helps you understand that it was important or valuable in each of those stages.
Totally. I mean, tracking different KPIs for different platforms, different stage in the customer journey is crucial. Like if you go into it expecting to get leads from a brand awareness TikTok campaign, you're going to shut it off because you're not going to get leads. But that's not necessarily the point. It's to elevate the awareness. And we'll go into this in a later episode of how to kind of measure all of that. That gets really complicated, but it's super important, especially in the world of B2B where you got 6 to 18-month sales cycles and you need to be doing all these things, and not everything's going to have a direct response kind of KPI associated with it. But we could go down that rabbit hole another day. But I think what you started to say there around seeing what works in different places and scaling that up is a good segue for the next part of this conversation, which people have been hearing us talk for the last 20 minutes or so and probably like, shit, like this is a lot of work between segmenting by ICP, by potentially geo, by customer journey phase, by platform, and personalizing that. How do you think about creating content like this at scale? And something that you and TJ, our other B2B team lead, have talked about consistently over the past year or so that I've taken and applied to Level's own marketing and other clients I've worked on is this concept of 1 to 8. Do you want to introduce that and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. And you can call it 1 to 8. Sometimes we call it 1 to many. We don't always hit 8. But the concept here is once you've created a piece of content, it shouldn't live in isolation as one unique piece of content. It should have the capacity to scale up and be valuable across multiple channels and across multiple executions. So what does that really look like in practice? We think about, I'm pulling from things that we're actively doing right now, right? But we have a client who does a webinar strategy. This is actually probably one of their biggest generators of moving people from an early stage of awareness into a conversation. It's really valuable for them. It also means that once a month or once every 6 weeks, however frequently we run these, we can take that single webinar asset. We can make sure we have a blog post related to it. We draw from that same asset and we might create a downloadable takeaway, a resource guide, a spreadsheet, something that a person can actively use that comes right out of that same content stream. We have multiple emails that help drive people to the live recording as well as afterward to watch a gated version of it. We use it on our organic, they use it for organic social posting, and we use it on a paid organics standpoint, cutting it up, smaller videos for ads, as well as, again, driving people to a gated opportunity to watch the webinar after the fact on demand. And so I don't know if we've hit quite 8 in that. I think we might have 6 executions out of it. But really, we're doing one webinar and saying, okay, this is the topic that matters right now for this industry. These are the people who we're going to show this topic to. And then how do we make sure it's not just a webinar up and gone, but it lives on in a longer sense on their paid and organic channels? And it really just maxes out the use of it. So we go from, the 10 or so hours it takes to produce it, and then maybe 10 hours of content development afterward. And we have some evergreen resources to use.
Totally. I think that is the key. Like having one pillar effort for your content strategy, like a webinar or like a podcast. I'll go into, I think a good example of this too is what we're doing literally right now and how Level does this. And we can give you a peek behind the curtain of how we use the podcast as our core piece of content that we spend the majority of our time on. But then you're able to get, it's not always 8, but many different pieces of content that span across that customer journey and span across the different types of consumption modes that we were talking about. And you can cater it to different platforms by just focusing on one key piece of content. One idea becomes a lot of different ideas for different ways people are coming across your brand across the marketing ecosphere. So just to give a tangible example of that, this podcast, we record it on video, and it gets put onto Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube. That's longer form content for people that are like really drilling into Level and want to spend 30 minutes, an hour listening to a piece of content. Then we take snippets of video from this that we delivered. Like the TikTok example is a perfect example of that from earlier, that we inserted directly into TikTok, LinkedIn, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, where it's just quick hits where people are in a passive consumption mode. And then you mentioned like the blog. We'll take it, and this is where I think we can start getting into the AI piece that I mentioned a little bit earlier, because that makes this even easier now. Like you can take the transcription of the podcast episode and say, hey, ChatGPT, turn this into a blog post for me, optimized for these keywords. And you have a blog post, and then you can take it again and say, hey, ChatGPT, turn this into an ebook that summarizes the key points and turn it into a checklist. And that's like a downloadable piece that, again, is like someone in a more active consumption mode. So you start to see all the different ways that you can go with this just from focusing on one pillar effort in one pillar piece of content. Then now it's easier than ever to take the one-day approach with AI, and you can automate that a little bit. But that's how you scale, right? That's how you create all of these different pieces of content consistently and hopefully relatively painlessly if you're using some AI and automation and you're really able to streamline that process. But just to bring this full circle, like we talked about 3 different ICPs, like let's just keep it the level example again. If we're talking, we have clients in EDU, B2B, and e-commerce. If we're recording that on a rotating basis where this episode's going to focus on EDU, this episode's going to focus on B2B, this next one will focus on e-commerce, and we do that over and over again in a continuous cycle, you start to see how we have a lot of new content consistently. We have a lot of new messages to test that we know are relevant to that audience because we're focusing on pain points like we talked about earlier, and we're able to see what's working and what resonates through that advertising and push more if the data tells us to go there.
The data story, I think, is huge. And I want to come back to the AI piece here too. Because I think what we're describing, this podcast or the webinars, that might feel like it's another thing. You got to add this. Now all of a sudden we have to do this webinar, or we have to add this like big splashy heavy lift content to come back and build these 8 or whatever. But one thing that we do is we look at analytics and say, okay, well, what were the most popular blogs? So when we have a client that's doing a lot of organic content generation already, and that's part of our core strategy, we might go look at what's the most successful thing in the last 90 days. What are the keywords, or who are the audiences that we want to make sure we're like doubling down on? And then we might propose, hey, let's do a webinar or a more like juicier piece of content. Or we might do what you described with the AI tools. Can we take that one blog and then, is there a checklist? Can we add that checklist to the blog link, right? Can we get that right in there, make it a useful resource that someone can capture while they're at that high point of engagement with the content already? It's already got all that SEO juice behind it. So you're kind of doubling down on something that's already working, and it doesn't take a heavy lift. So, your analysis as you start incorporating AI tools and you start thinking about other channels you want to activate, that analysis might be where for the first couple of months of the strategy like this, you're spending 60 or 70% of your time doing that and the planning, and 30 or 40% of your time executing. And over time, as you learn your audiences and you get that sort of more rhythmic, scalable thing in place, you can start to turn toward higher and higher levels of production.
Totally.
But I love the AI conversation. Let's take a bite out of that for a moment. I use it for so many things today. And if you're not using AI to help you find opportunities in conversations with your customers, you are missing the boat. I don't think we've put anything into market that is truly written by ChatGPT, but I also, we use it constantly on our team to uncover other resources, similar things that people are reading about or using that fit our profiles or our ICPs. And we do use it to break certain concepts down. How do we find patterns within a certain story? So I think the AI piece, ChatGPT being kind of the thing that surfaces, but we use Market Muse, we use even things like demand-based tools where they can generate keyword lists for you. We're using all of those to understand what's the opportunity to have a conversation with somebody right now and what do they care about. And from there, your content starts to build on it. And you can, like you said, run it through and say like, all right, we've got this blog, make it into a checklist. And then as humans, we have to go look at that checklist and say like, some of this is a little funky. Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's clean it up. Let's make it sound like a person. But it's handy to have that start and to find those patterns that we might not see as we're moving fast and working as individual marketers.
Totally. I think I totally agree with that. There's rarely an instance where we're like, almost never an instance, honestly, where we give something to ChatGPT. It spits out the most perfect blog post that you've ever seen, and we publish it on the Level website. Like, my perspective on this is it helps you get to different ideas faster that help you to bolster your own ideas. So you might put that into ChatGPT, say, give me a blog post, and it's like, this piece and this piece I don't like, but I probably wouldn't have thought to have said this piece, and I do like this, and I'm going to combine it with my own thoughts here, and it kind of becomes this mishmash of your own ideas plus AI generated stuff that gets you to ideas that maybe would have taken you days to get to in the past. And I think the research piece of it that you alluded to is really interesting too. Because it helps. It's about speed, right? Like, some of that research that you would have done that you would have had to use a regular search engine for in the past might have taken you hours because you got to sift through all this information. You don't even know if it's the right article when you click on it. And then with AI, like, it just gives you the answer. Like, you want to vet that, of course, but it just helps you get to the information that you're looking for faster. And I'm just going to share a little anecdote I was just at the Forrester B2B Summit in Austin earlier this week. And forgive me, I forget his name, who did the original keynote, but he was talking about AI, and he gave this his hot take is search is going to be gone as we know it. The next couple of years because of that reason. Like, you have to sift through so much crap to get to the answer that you want. With AI, like, it just gives it to you. And I think people are really going to start. I agree with his take. I think that's going to really start catching on. You're going to see big shifts in how search happens. But he gave an example of, he was on his flight down there. There was a delay because they had a flat tire on the airplane, and he was trying to determine, like, do I need to get on another flight? Do I need to call my assistant and change flights? How long is this going to take? And he just went to ChatGPT, asked it how long it takes to change the tire on the Boeing 737 or whatever it was. And it was like 20 minutes per tire. If you got to change 4 tires, blah, blah, blah. And it told him ultimately it's going to take like 2 hours. And then he said the pilot got on the speaker right after that and said it's going to take about 2 hours. So AI was correct. Helped him make the decision to pivot to get on another flight.
That's totally a hilarious example. I would have never thought of that, but I'll share my my funny personal use of it is I run a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, and so this past week I had a little thing set up for my players, and I was like, man, I need a good puzzle, and I'm really struggling. They wanted to do some things that were more puzzle based because they're still earlier in the campaign, so they don't have a lot of fighting power, and they need some things to like boost up that experience point. And I was really stuck. Like, I wanted to write something original, and I had these ideas in my head. I knew it had to factor in a mirror because of this like thing that they need later in the game. I knew it had to factor in this like elemental component. And I was like, I wonder what ChatGPT would do in this case. And it came back to me with 10 ideas, and I picked, I think, 2 of them, and I wrote the rest of it myself. But I used that, and it was a fun way to kind of take these seeds of an idea that I had and say, like, I'm not getting there myself. I'm not writing something complicated or interesting to solve. ChatGPT, like, what can you do? And it came back to me with some great answers. So I find these funny little ways to use it all the time. And you're totally right. Like, what is the future of search marketing when you don't need a website to answer it, but you need experts to tell a communication tool what the answer is? We have a big fun problem ahead of us as marketers right now in the way we approach SEO.
It's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out in the next couple of years. But I think just to tie a bow on this, like what you said there is like, so like that's how I see it working. Like you have the seeds of what you want to say, which to tie it back to this conversation is your research and your understanding of your audience and the insights that you get from interacting with those customers and your client that AI is not going to have, and giving it that understanding and some guidance to help you get to an idea faster. And then you're able to kind of meld your own mind with the ideas that you're getting from there. And then it gets you to market faster, you're able to test faster, figure out what's working faster, and ultimately be more efficient. I think that's how this really applies to the content game. And just to kind of tie a bow on this whole thing, like the point here is to understand your ICPs, understand who your customers are. What are the segments within those ICPs and those larger customer segments where there's key differences where you have to personalize to make it relevant, and then choose some sort of core piece of content that's related to each of those and expand on that. And that's how you really are able to get personal across your entire audience at scale, in my opinion. That's a playbook that we've been taking at Level and with our clients.
Perfect. And I think in a practical sense, as you take this, as marketers take this forward, if you're not already in a rhythm like this, remember to plan your time. Like I said, if you're starting a new content strategy and you're just diving in with an audience, 60 or 70% of your time should be spent on the data, the analysis, the research, the planning. And once you get that right, that content piece scales really fast. But you have to have that strong baseline to know who you're talking to and what's going to resonate with them. And nothing can fill in those gaps besides just diving in. So remember, as you're building this, if you're approaching a new personalized content strategy, bake that time in for yourself. Don't try to rush it and throw too much out there at once, or you're never going to know where to spend your focus and scale up accordingly.
Totally. I think that's the advice for people looking to get started. It's like, get that foundation, spend your time understanding the audience and setting the strategy, and then it's going to be so much easier for you to scale. And that's key to being able to leverage things like AI at this point too. Cool.
Awesome. Thanks, Dale.
I really appreciate you taking the time to join us again today. I know you'll be back for some episodes here in the future. If you've made it this far, thanks for listening. And until next time, connect with us on LinkedIn, YouTube, where we're always sharing insightful content around how to make your business grow smarter and faster through performance marketing.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.